All right, we're back here with Nate from NextGen. Nate, thanks for joining us on the top 10 questions that Nate gets. Transmission questions. Are these questions you typically get when people call in to the shop?
These are the most common questions that I see people asking my staff or that people frequently email us. They're just common questions that we hear on a repetitive basis.
All right, let's fire it off. So this came in from this is a question I got an email too. I sent it to you. Should you eliminate your transmission thermostats or install thermostat bypasses to lower the temperatures, and why?
Sure. So 99% of the time, I would say yes. There's a reason that almost every kit we design circumvents the thermostat system so that you have full-time cooler flow. The reason I think that's important is because decreasing the mean operating temperature or the average temperature the transmission is exposed to across its lifespan has a direct relationship to its longevity, specifically for electronics. And so bringing down that average operating temperature is only beneficial. Now, people say, well, is there such a thing as too cold? There is, but you're never going to reach too cold by bypassing a thermostat. Too cold is when the fluid is so cold that it can't actually travel throughout the transmission quickly and efficiently. So, if you think about it, if you get in your truck or your car on a cold day and it's 32 degrees outside and you just drive away, you're driving a transmission that's running at 32 degrees and it works fine. So, not that I would recommend that in general, that seems to be a bit extreme. But if your transmission is regularly running at 100 degrees after, for example, installing one of our kits or something like, or a bypass or whatever have you, there's really no downside to that. And so, generally speaking, I would say that it's a good thing to do because of that. And keep in mind that electronics, their mortal enemy is heat. This is why all these fancy computers have crazy cooling systems. Heat damages electronics. So, the 1% of the time where I think it's not a good idea is very radical cold weather climates, like places where it's never warm. So, for example, if you were in northern Canada and it's freezing all year round, then the extra support getting up to operating temperature is probably more useful than bringing the mean operating temps down when they're already very low and well within safe numbers. So, for a very, very small portion of people, maybe it's not a good idea. But if you don't live in the mountains of northern Canada and like the Yukon territories or something, it's probably a good idea.
All right, what's the most important transmission upgrade and why?
Well, it's definitely a valve body. Now, I know that some people are going to say, well, of course you think that you design valve body parts. It's the other way around. I design valve body parts because I think that. Um, we collect failure data on most things that we work on, and that's how we know what to design. So if we see that out of 50 transmissions, 45 of them had the same failure, such as the 8L90 with their pulse dampeners, well, then we know that's probably what we should invent first. And when you collect data like this on transmissions and you observe failures for the average person, so I'm not talking 2,000 horsepower race cars because obviously you're going to get very different data from that. I'm talking the average person who drives their vehicle and needs to trust it. Um, Valve bodies monopolize all of the most common causes of failure on almost everything. 8L45, 10R80, 10L80, 10-speed Allison, 68 RFE, AS68, AS69, all that stuff. Um, Valve bodies top the charts. In fact, out of like the 10 most common failures, like 7 or 8 of them will be valve body failures. Um, so the reality is that regardless of my opinion or other people's opinion, the fact are that the vast majority of transmission failures are a valve body failure or happened because of a valve body failure, which means if you can prevent valve body failure, you can prevent the majority of transmission failures. And this is why a comprehensive valve body upgrade kit that actually fixes all of the major problems, not a random valve here or a spring there, but a comprehensive kit with separator plates, all of those things, is such a benefit to people. And that is why I invest this company's efforts in getting products like that on market. It's because they have the most benefit to the public, and the public has been very clear about that. And so that's why I believe and why I observe fact that the valve body is the most important upgrade on any and every modern transmission.
All right, next one. What's the best transmission temperature and why?
It's very hard to give a magic number because there's no magic number. What I can say is that the 120 to 170 range seems to be the sweet spot for longevity and usability. Much south of that, and you start getting a little bit of sludginess, slow reaction when the converter's unlocked, things like that. And much above that, and you're inhibiting longevity because you're exposing the electronic components inside the transmission to sustained high temperatures. And that's very damaging to electronics. And I would reference my computer analogy earlier. All those big fancy hardworking computers have crazy cooling systems because electronics, their kryptonite is heat. And so it's hard to give a specific answer, but what I can say is that you're not going to make it run too cold with, valve body and thermostat upgrades, which are usually the same thing. Um, so as a function of that, I would say the cooler the better. There is obviously a cutoff point, but you're not going to get to that cutoff point. So if you can do something to decrease temperatures, like a thermostat bypass or a valve body upgrade or a pan or something, that is generally good to do.
So it seems like in the modern trucks, most of the trucks after, say, 2020-ish, it almost seems like all of them are designed to run at like 190, 200 all the time. And so if someone's not towing, is that still something that is just going to eat away at the clutch plates and be more damaging to them?
Well, absolutely, because the main failure that comes from heat exposure, low intensity sustained heat exposure, is electronic failure. And electronics don't care if you're towing. Electronics care if they're getting baked in 200-degree oil all the time. So, yes, it absolutely does. And in addition to that, these electronics are not designed for exposure to that sort of temperature all the time. And that's why you see a lot of electronic failures in vehicles that are exposed to high temperatures all the time. They're just computers. They're small computers. And what happens when you cook a computer? I mean, it's going to have problems, right? So, I would say that temperature management is generally super important for electronic longevity. And what you do with the vehicle has no relationship with electronic longevity. Electronic longevity is almost exclusively a function of use time and exposure to high temperatures.
All right, next one. How frequently should I change my transmission fluid and should I change it at all? We get that from the people that say it's lifetime fluid.
Yeah, there is no such thing as lifetime fluid. That's like a lifetime condom. It's just not true. So, lifetime fluid is a nonsensical fantasy that OEMs came up with so that your transmissions would fail sooner. It's right up there with 10 or 15,000 mile oil change intervals. Well, you can absolutely change your oil every 15,000 miles if you want to change your engine every 100. So, that's what lifetime fill is. And here's the other thing. How is it that one manufacturer using a specific transmission, let's say the 8 HP 55, would say that it's a lifetime fill transmission, but then another manufacturer using the exact same transmission says you need to do it every 30,000 miles? Well, somebody's lying. So obviously, there's falsehoods with that. So, as far as I am concerned, you should change your transmission fluid. However, how you do it and how frequently you do it is important. So, if you're somebody with 300,000 miles and you've never changed the fluid, it is very possible that you agitate clutch material and bushing material and things like that that have found resting places, usually in corners, in the valve body or the pump. Um, and when you agitate them, they can travel somewhere else where they create an issue. And this is why you hear about people who, their vehicle is fine, they change their fluid, now it doesn't run right. Keep in mind, something as small as a human hair can stick a valve in certain scenarios. So it's very important that we don't agitate waste material that's inside the system that has found somewhere to compact and become static. So the way that you get around that is by not using these high pressure flushing systems on high mileage units. So in my personal opinion, the best way to manage your transmission fluid, and you can do this at any mileage and at any time, is simply a drain and fill with an OEM filter. If you get an OEM filter and you just drain the fluid and you just fill it back up until it's balanced, or you replace the exact same amount you pulled out, contingent that you do that correctly, you won't hurt anything. And even if you have a bunch of waste matter like clutch material and things like that in the transmission, um, that oil will not be agitated in a way where it's now cycling everywhere else because you didn't pressurize the system in order to effectuate that oil change. So, what I would do at any mileage on any vehicle is maybe every 30,000 ish miles for the average person, just drain it out, fill it back with fluid, and do an OEM filter if you want to remove the pan. That's what I would do. As for what fluid to use, you will always be at least not wrong with OEM fluid. But there are some vehicles where I would recommend a different unit or a different fluid, excuse me. So, for example, on the 8-speed General Motors units, I definitely recommend the Mobil One Full Synthetic Low Viscosity High Performance Oil. I'm not getting paid to say that. I have no relationship with Mobil One. I'm just saying that's exactly what I would put in that unit. It's a lower viscosity oil, and this can minimize some of that shuttering behavior that takes place when the pulse dampeners wear out. And that would be an important thing to change during a fluid service. So it's kind of nuanced, but that would be my advice to the average person.
Next up, how many gears or speed should a transmission have optimally?
There are a lot of variables, but what I can say is the number's definitely not 10. And so I think that 4 to 6 is a sweet spot. I can see in some sports cars with long gears and a lot of torque, specifically like supercharged sports cars, maybe 7 or 8 being the right answer. Something like a Hellcat, they have 8 speeds. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. Um, I think that if you're just looking for general reliability, something with 4 to 6 speeds is nice. 4 speeds is nice because you can get a governor pressure unit rather than a computerized unit when you go down to 4 speeds. Governor pressure, in my opinion, is simpler and more repairable. And you don't have the barrier of dealing with electronics, at least not to the same extent. Um, the average person can fix a 47 RH. The average person is not going to fix a DT12 or a DL 800 or something like that. So I think that the simpler the better, generally speaking. What people need to understand is that the reason that we keep seeing more gears in transmissions is for no reason other than to comply with the EU 6 emission standards and to pay less fines as part of the CAFE standards in the United States. So EU 6 emission standards, which is Europe's Bible for emissions regulation with cars, they measure the mass of carbon dioxide emitted from the vehicle adjusted for the distance that the vehicle was driven. And they usually do this in like kilograms per 100 kilometers or something. And so, if you can decrease the mass of the carbon dioxide exiting the vehicle, this number looks better. I think that this is a very bad rubric to use for emissions, but what do I know? Um, in addition to that, in the United States, we have CAFE ratings, which obviously automakers have found every single way imaginable around. Like more pickup trucks, more commercial vehicles, licensing cars from economy brands like Aston Martin did with the Signet, where they private labeled a Toyota product just so that they would pay less CAFE fines, things like that. So, when you create regulations, it's no different than like really aggressive, really strict parenting. You're probably just making the kid better at lying, to be honest. And that's what happens when you impose that aggressive parenting style on companies. They get better at lying. If you tell your kid you're not allowed to have a beer or something, they're just going to have a beer when you're not around. You know what I mean? And whether you agree or you disagree, the fact of the matter is we were all teenagers and we all know what we did when we were told no. And it was yes when the parents weren't around, right? And that's what happens in corporate America with some of these nonsensical regulations that incentivize them to get creative. And when people say, well, I disagree with that, okay, well, then explain to me why Aston Martin sold an economy car based off a car that college girls get. Well, because they were getting around cafe standards. Like Google it, Aston Martin Signet, like Google it. So this is not new behavior. But basically, governments create regulations that pressure automotive companies to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, just like AFM and DFM on the General Motors modern engines. General Motors, regardless of the beef that we and them had, um, General Motors made some of the most reliable engines ever, ever. Okay, like all the LSs. They're amazing engines. They're far more reliable than any L87 6.2 liter that they have today. Well, why did they do AFM? Why did they do DFM? Like, where do these things come from? Well, they come from regulatory compliance. And so when you create these senseless regulations, you create vehicles that are difficult to own. And an example of that is these, 37 speed transmissions, hyperbolically speaking. You don't need all these gears. They're doing this so that the engine has a greater quantity of gear ratios to choose from to optimize for minimum CO2 emissions and slightly higher fuel economy. And for the extra mile per gallon you may get in perfect conditions, you now have a transmission that's 5 times the price of something with 4 gears. So I just think that it's senseless. I think that it's all to comply with regulations. I think those regulations hurt the consumer. I don't think they have the impact on the environment that they're supposed to. And I think that they're wastes of time. And I think that 4 through 7 speed transmissions are the sweet spot for 95% of vehicles. And I think that there are some applications where lower or higher would make sense, but the average pickup truck does not need 10 gears. That's why there's so many complicated components that we seek to remove and eliminate and delete, is they have parts that don't need to be there. And the other thing is that when you make a company redesign their transmission every 10 years, they really don't have time to make it reliable, even if they wanted to, which they usually don't, but even if they did, because by the time the transmission would become optimized, they have to sell something else because it doesn't comply with emissions regulations. So it's complicated, but too long didn't read would be 4 to 8 speeds depending on the application. More speeds for performancey stuff and less speeds for simpler stuff.
What is the most effective way to extend the life of a factory transmission, keep it from failing?
Sure. Well, there's two things. So one obviously is removing or upgrading all of the components that are likely to fail in the valve body, and that's what a valve body upgrade does, a comprehensive one. Now, the second thing that's also important is obviously fluid maintenance. Um, Oil devolves into liquid sandpaper as time goes on, because all of that material that's coming off of the bushings, the clutches, etc., is being captured in the oil. And that's why the oil starts to get dark. It's not because it's burning. If you boil water, it doesn't turn black. The reason the oil is changing color is because you're getting microparticles from things like the clutches or the bushings that are getting captured in the oil. And those microparticles are very similar to the microparticles that are used for sandpaper, except instead of being carried on a sheet of thick paper, they're being carried in an oil. And so transmission fluid literally becomes liquid sandpaper over time. And so it's important that you change it regularly, semi regularly. And that's why I say, perhaps on an annual basis or 30,000 ish miles, depending how much the vehicle's driven, is doing a drain and fill. You're only going to get maybe a third to half of the oil out of the system, but that's better than getting none of it out. Keeping the oil healthy has a direct relationship to the longevity of those parts. And so eliminating failure prone components in the valve body, because that seems to be epicentric to the vast majority of transmission failures, and servicing the fluid are the two most potent ways to extend the vehicle's lifespan and to prevent failures.
All right, this is going to be a fun one. What's a torque converter and what does it do?
Okay. So I'm going to do what's never been done and try to explain this without a bunch of visual aids. So a torque converter, there are two different types of torque converter. You have a lockup style torque converter and a non-lockup style torque converter. A lockup style torque converter, and I'm going to get into this, but just so everybody knows, lockup and non-lockup, a lockup style torque converter has a clutch in the front. And when that clutch turns on, it makes the crankshaft on the engine and the input shaft on the transmission spin at the exact same speed. Non-lockup style torque converters don't have this system. And so there's no way to get them to spin at a 1-to-1 speed ratio because there's no clutch up there. So we need to understand that there are two different types. What a torque converter is an oil coupling system at the front of the transmission that's shaped kind of like it's like a giant bagel or something, right? You can Google it, right? Yeah, you can attach a visual aid maybe. What a torque converter does is it has two fins inside, two impellers that look very vaguely like propellers off of an airplane, but with a whole lot of fins rather than just two or four or whatever. And what these two impellers do is they circulate oil between them. And between those two impellers is a part that looks kind of like a wheel on a turbo called a stator. And these three components together um, allow for a speed difference between the crankshaft and the input shaft. They allow the crankshaft to spin and the input shaft to spin at a slower speed. And this means that you can come to a stop without choking out the engine like you would in a manual transmission vehicle. And so the intent here is to smoothen out driving. Now, what a torque converter does is it is pressurized with oil that circulates through this system all the time. And the speed difference that the torque converter allows is called stall speed. So let's say that a torque converter, the angle of the fins and everything else, the stator dimensions, all of that, allow for a maximum speed difference between the crankshaft and the input shaft of 2000 RPM. That would be a torque converter with a stall speed of 2000 RPM. Now, some converters, like I said, have a lockup system in the front. What those converters do is once you get up to a certain speed, this oil coupling process is no longer very efficient. You lose torque, you lose fuel economy, and you gain heat. At that point, that converter clutch will turn on, in which case the torque converter basically just becomes a big clutch. And so it no longer does torque converter things, and it is just a clutch. Now, lockup style torque converters are standard in the automotive industry now because of how much faster vehicles are designed to go, increasing speed limits on freeways and things like that. Non lockup style torque converters went out of fashion in the 90s and 2000s, mainly in the 90s. That is no longer a technology that's on public roadways and new cars. So when you come to a stop and the vehicle doesn't choke out or anything, it's probably because of your torque converter, assuming you have one. Obviously, dual clutches are a little bit different. Independent shift rod units a little different, but the vast majority of modern consumer cars have a torque converter, and that is how that works.
Kind of went through this already, but the most common failure points, I think you're probably thinking valve body, but is this more inside the transmission as caused from the valve body?
Well, the most common failure point, like I said, is the valve body. It's not even remotely close. For the average person, it is the vast majority of them are valve body failures. Now,
Okay.
above and beyond that, clutches can burn up, shafts can snap, bushings can wear out. I mean, any part of any transmission can fail. The question is, how do we prevent that? Well, if you don't have a crazy amount of power, I always have to cycle out the, 2000 horsepower race cars because they experience different failures than 99% of people watching this video would. So, for example, when you see a bushing wear out in a transmission, it was probably deprived of oil, which means you probably have a leak in the lubrication circuit somewhere, which means you probably have a leaking lube regulator valve, which means that you probably needed a valve body. Or for example, let's say the overdrive clutches in your 68 RFE failed. Well, um, I can guarantee you that unless you have a bunch of power, the end plugs around the solenoid switch valve are leaking, which means you needed a valve body. Or let's say the 456 clutch failed in your 6R140. Um, if you don't have a lot of power, it's probably because you didn't have enough pressure going to those clutches, meaning that you were probably losing that pressure somewhere, meaning you probably needed a valve body. So most roads lead back to valve body. And that's why I think it's so important for people to have education on valve bodies. It is literally epicentric to everything that goes right or wrong with the vast majority of transmissions. I understand that there's always an outlier in every set of data that's like, hey, I have a bone stock truck and I snapped a shaft or something. I don't dispute that that happens. But when you have a ceiling perspective view of failures, and you see that failures like that encompass 2 to 3% of people who experience a transmission failure, well then yeah, I mean there's millions of transmissions out there. You are going to see things like that semi-frequently. And when you have hundreds of millions of cars on the road in the United States, you can find a couple of examples of everything, no matter how rare it is. The
Yeah.
reality is, what is the 95% and what is the 5%? The 95% is a valve body. And this is why it's so important to know what you're getting in your valve body. And this is why I tell people, even if you're not shopping here, take this advice anywhere. Make them send you pictures of what they're actually doing. Say, is that stock? Do you make that? Can I just do this myself for $50 and you're charging me 2,000? Ask questions. Be a smart consumer. Do that to us too. We'll pass the test because we have nothing to hide. You have to know what you're getting in your valve body. When people say I have a built valve body, my first question is what's built about it? Other than the stickers that came in the box, what's built about it? And then you realize they bought $40 in parts on eBay or at their transmission parts house. And the other, like, let's say the product's $2,500, right? And $40 of that was upgrades. It sounds to me like you spent $2,460 on branding. And that's sad. People need to ask what's in their product. So I would say valve body, and I would say to ask every question on planet Earth and make sure you know what you're buying and make sure that there are pictures of the upgrades available to you. If somebody wants several $1,000s of your money, they can show you what you're paying for.
This question comes up a lot. When is the right time to upgrade the transmission valve body? Because you get guys that are low mileage trucks asking this question.
That's like saying when's the best time to stop smoking? Well, the best time to stop smoking is before you start. The second best time is now, and the worst time is after something bad happens. So the stock components that are designed to erode slowly eat away at things like clutches and bushings and everything else. And so the best thing to do is to stop that bleeding as early in the lifespan of the vehicle as possible. Obviously, if you've already got high mileage or something, look, if you're running and driving it, clearly it's a working transmission. That's probably the time. Because when you're at high mileage, every time you drive the vehicle, you're spinning a roulette wheel that you don't land on the green tile, that something breaks, right? Well, that means you've gotten your use out of that valve body, and maybe that's a compelling argument to now finally upgrade the thing to prevent those failures. So there's really no bad time. I would just argue that the best time is immediately because, and people are going to say, well, you sell valve body parts, conflict of interest. Listen, that's why I know so much about this, is because I design them for a living. So you're not going to find some guy that works at Arby's that knows what I know about valve bodies. So you have to understand, like, that's the whole reason I'm here. So I'm just being honest when I tell people there's really no bad time to do something that prevents common failures if it's within budget and it makes personal sense for you. Now, in addition to that, I would say that a common question that we hear is my transmission too far gone at a high mileage? Well, if you're not currently having issues, it will only logically run better because you're going to be repairing all these issues that maybe don't immobilize the vehicle, but certainly exist by the time you get to 150, 180,000 miles. On the flip side, we get asked, is it too early? Well, the reality is that every time you drive the vehicle, some imperfection in the hydraulic systems of that valve body is eating away at something. This is why every time you drive the vehicle, the oil gets a little dirtier. Well, what argument could a reasonable person possibly make, short of it just not being in budget or something, to not perform preventative maintenance and a driving enhancement upgrade at that exact juncture? I don't really feel like there is one unless you're just selling the vehicle tomorrow. So I think that's the beauty of performing transmission upgrades that people really should communicate to the public, is that they are a performance and a reliability upgrade at the same time. That's very rare. It's very rare that you find an upgrade that enhances performance and reliability. And transmissions, specifically billet valve body upgrades, do exactly that.
All right. What's the most important change that manufacturers could make to make transmissions, the modern ones, more reliable?
Use better parts and stop adding systems that don't need to be there. So simplify things. So if If we deleted, for example, pulse dampeners in 8L90s, the vast majority of them wouldn't fail. That's why I designed a kit for that, right? So you don't need a kit that's made right there. So you don't need a lot of the parts in modern transmissions. So why are they there? I have been vocal for years that they design these parts so that these things break, and then they can charge you for the replacement parts. I've been vocal that that's what I believe. And I'm completely confident that I'm correct. That is my opinion. So I would say removing unnecessary parts, which is why we design all of these delete kits for all this stuff. Like beat us to the punch. Beat us to the punch. Why don't you delete the stuff? Because you make money selling unreliable stuff. We make money selling reliable stuff. We have the opposite business model, and you can see it in the product. That's why they sell parts that have all these redundant, unnecessary parts, and we sell a way to literally permanently delete the stuff. Make them simpler. Beat us to the punch. You know why I'm willing to give away the golden ticket of how to beat us to the punch in a YouTube video? Well, because they're not going to do it. I've been saying it for years and they refuse to do it. They want to make things that are unreliable. It makes them money.
Yeah. Yeah. They'll never stop because even if 100,000 people buy your kits, they still have 400,000 that didn't, and they'll make money off of them.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Nate. Appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody will love it. We went over 30 minutes. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, be a smart consumer, question everything, even us. Don't trust anybody. Don't trust us. Don't trust the guy down the road. Do not trust anyone. Look into everything independently. Form your own opinions. You never know who you can trust. And I'm not going to be a hypocrite and say to treat my staff any differently. Investigate everything. Trust but verify. Do not trust the automotive industry. The automotive industry lies to people every day of their life. It took me 10 years to get to a point in my career where I was willing to spin the roulette wheel because I knew I could just go away and be okay. And now that I'm at that point, I want everybody to know how ridiculous and dishonest and generally wrong a lot of the behavior here is. I'm not saying I'm perfect. There's plenty of stuff that I look back at and I say, did I make the best decision at that time? Honestly, no. And I feel bad and I'd like to, make right for, getting a bad part and not knowing it was a bad part. And then we found out after we gave somebody a refund or something. Like, I'm not asking people to be superheroes because everyone is just human. I'm human, everyone's human. Where I draw the line is lying to the public with the intent to make more money off them by misinforming them. And I see that every day in big aftermarket and big OEM. And it deeply frustrates me because I feel like I'm competing with people and and using my staff and their talents to compete with people who are willing to say things that are not true. And so it puts us in a position where we have to fight lies with the truth, and that's really demoralizing. And I think that the best way to solve that problem is to just give people information so that they can be informed and educated and understand. And I frankly, I call on and I summon other engineers in their sub professions, whether it's turbos or suspensions or whatever, to do just that. So yeah, don't trust anybody. Be a smart consumer, and I support all you guys, and I love when you guys reach out to different YouTube channels asking questions. Hopefully, I can help.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah, talk to you soon.